Special educational needs and disabilities is our focus this morning, and we're looking at specifically how governors ensure pupils' needs are being met. My name is Steve Barker, and together with my colleague Linda. Morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
We are here from Better Governor, delighted to be joining our colleagues from Governors for Schools again. And we are going to guide you through this session this morning. But as I say, it is your session, so please do make comments, ask us questions as we're going through. What we're going to cover in today's session, first and foremost, is to look at the statutory role of both maintained schools and academies. There is no difference with regard to SEND and particularly our responsibilities for meeting pupils' needs. We're going to hopefully bring a little bit of clarity to how, as governors and trustees, our monitoring should inform our strategic overview. And I think it's very easy with SEND to actually get mired into a lot of the detail. As with all other aspects of governance, this isn't about individual pupils, this isn't about individual cases, etc. This is about our strategic overview as a board. And what we're also going to try and do as we go through the session is outline what governance should actually be monitoring and a few best practice tips along the journey, which hopefully will give us some insight into how we ensure that pupils with special educational needs and disabilities are actually having those needs met in their schools. So with no more ado, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk you through the first couple of slides, and I will join you again shortly.
Well, good morning, everyone. What I'd like to start off with this early part of the session is to just clarify the approach we should take from our legal and regulatory responsibilities as governors, and then we'll move through into those later parts of the session as Steve described. So first of all, we have two main guidance documents that are available to the governors of maintained schools, as you can see, coloured with the pink border here, and then guidance for academy trust governors. And again, remember that with academy trust governance, it may look slightly different in its operation because the guidance is for the trust, and then the trust put in place how much of those responsibilities and in what way they are delivered at school-based level. So if you have local committees, local governing boards, they might look slightly different in their responsibilities because they are being directed by whatever decisions have been made at trust board level. However, and Steve made that point very clearly when we talked about the aims of this session, the responsibilities for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities are exactly the same in terms of what we need to do as governors to ensure that all of those children are getting those equal opportunities for a good education in school. So let's have a look at what the guidance, what the legal expectations are in a little bit more detail. So first of all, there is a statutory responsibility. So the legal responsibility is placed on the school, and our role as governors is ensuring that those responsibilities are met, those duties are met, they are complied with in full, both in terms of policy, in terms of procedure, and in terms of delivery down at school level. In the guidance, it talks about, and it uses a language of must and should. We have talked about this before in previous webinars, but just to clarify, where it says must, there is no option but to comply in full. Where it says should, then it is expected that that is what will happen unless you have a better approach than that. So you should be able to explain your workings, if you like, if you don't meet that responsibility in that particular way. So here it is saying in the guidance for maintained schools that a designated governor should be responsible for special education needs and disabilities. Now, this is not that that person is solely responsible for the whole governing body and everyone else can take a back seat on that, but they should have that deeper knowledge. They should develop a better understanding of the school's approach. They should have a slightly firmer monitoring role in what they do when they go in to visit the school, and they should report and share and open discussion with governors at governing body meetings. So that's the role of that designated governor, is to make sure that the rest of... Sorry.
Just to interrupt, sorry, Eva. I am aware that we've got several governors from independent schools with us today. Everything that we say, although we're actually quoting from the Maintained Schools guidance here, it's virtually word for word the same in the Academy's guidance, and actually those principles of good practice apply in any setting. So if you are in an independent school, yes, they absolutely apply to you as well. Sorry, thanks, Linda.
No, thank you, Steve. That's a helpful piece of information. So we have a role of an individual in school called a SENCO. They have those responsibilities. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. And there is a requirement in Maintained School, and as Steve said, this is good practice elsewhere, that a SENCO has been appointed. So somebody has that specific role. They are leading operationally in school. And usually, if you are the designated governor for SEND, you will be making your monitoring visits and having discussions with this lead individual, the SENCO for your school. And then importantly here, there is an expectation that governors have regard to the code of practice. And the code of practice I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a little while, but this is that document that sets out those responsibilities, those expectations for all children who have these special educational needs or disabilities. And it is a code which people are tested against. Have these things happened? Have these entitlements been met? Are we compliant with all of those expectations? So the Code of Practice is a really important document. It's quite lengthy, but if you are the designated governor for SEND, I think it is something that you should have at least dipped in and out of in preparation for your responsibility and your role, and also in terms of different aspects of practice as you go through the school year and you look at different things associated with the delivery of SEND in your school. So it starts with a very clear vision that there is to be no difference in the approach to children who have special educational needs and disabilities as for any other child or young person in your school. And the vision is that they achieve well in their early years at school and in college, and they lead happy and fulfilled lives. So unpicking what that actually means in practice and how that matches with your vision of where your vision for your school is and how that applies to everyone. It is about making comparisons to, looking at how the strategies, the policies, the actual lived life every day for this group of children matches with those expectations you have for any other child in the school. And for those children with quite complex needs who might be in special educational schools, then this code of practice you'll see goes up to 25 years, because some children with profound needs do in fact stay in an educational setting until the age of 25. So that's why it takes us right the way through to that age range. So it might be helpful to think a little bit about what is special educational needs and disabilities. How is that defined? Well, a child has a special educational need if they find it more difficult to learn, or they have a disability, which calls for, first of all, some identification that they are not doing as well as their peers, but also some extra provision, some extra support, some adaptation of equipment or approach. So a child who is now in school they are designated as having a learning difficulty or disability if they find it more difficult to learn than the majority of children that are the same age as them, or they have a recognised disability, a diagnosed disability, or they are already on the pathway of getting a diagnosis for a disability, but this prevents them from making use of the facilities that generally children in at the same age would use in their mainstream school, or that they would use if they are older in post-16 institutions. So it requires the school to think about, when they are looking at all the learners in the school, are some children not making the progress that they should? Are some children finding some things more difficult than others because they have already got a diagnosed disability, or they are already have been picked up and identified as struggling? And these difficulties can be picked up at any age, especially with the sort of developmentally delay kind of conditions, because when children start school, we expect a more less self-regulated approach, if you like, to learning, and we also expect them to be young children and have and be developing. So often these additional needs are picked up as they make that journey through the latter stages of primary school and into the beginning of their secondary education.
It's probably worth saying, Linda, just on that point, that the significantly greater difficulty than the majority of others, different local authorities will set slightly different benchmarks. So there's nothing in the code of practice that says how far behind a child has to be or how much greater of a difficulty. In the local authority where the schools where I'm a governor are based, it happens to be 2 years, but that does vary. So it's worth asking as governors if you don't know what that is. Obviously, schools will make provision for any child that's actually not making the same levels of progress as their peers. But from a special needs perspective, there will be slightly different expectations depending on where you are.
Thanks, Steve. So there is a glossary, and I think it's quite helpful sometimes if we unpick some of this terminology. So I've mentioned the SENCO, and they had that lead coordinator role. So that is where that acronym has its root from. You'll hear the word EHCP, that is an education and healthcare plan, and this is when those needs have been identified, recognised, a process has been gone through with outside agencies, and your local authority has put in place an education and healthcare plan that sets out what those extra support requirements are for that child. And then the school is duty bound to ensure that those are put in place to help support that child. With the ARP, this is additional resource provision. So these are identified resources that might support a child in their learning or their ability to move around the school or access their learning. It might be additional equipment that child might need, or it might be just in terms of printed resources or particular things that are relevant to that child's support. In many schools, there is a learning support assistant. In fact, there are a range of different acronyms to support children with different learning aspects. LSA is the most commonly used one, but you might have other members of your team. They might have an emotional, somebody specifically to support children with emotional difficulties. And so it is important that you understand where you're using acronyms in a wider sense, in a team that supports children in your school, that you understand what that looks like. We'll say a little bit more about that when Steve is talking about the detail later on. And then with each individual child that has been identified, there will be a pathway designed for that child, so a provision map for that individual child that feeds into, or leads down from is probably a better way of explaining it, from the provision map of your school. And again, Steve will talk a little bit more about that later. We've got a range of different acronyms to describe different children that have different types of difficulties. So we will be familiar with ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, and there are many others, ADHD, and a variety of different terminologies. The terminology is less important than the overall provision mapping for the school and the provision or the journey that has been mapped out for that individual child to provide the support that they need. And then again, there are a variety of others as with this high functioning autism and communication and interaction needs, particularly in this group of children, is an acronym that you might come across in a number of different ways. What I would say about acronyms in particular is that where your school might have designed a provision for the whole school that includes individuals that are specific to the context of your school, there may be acronyms that are, again, particular to your school. So if you hear some terminology, particularly if you're a new governor, in the discussions around SEND, ask what that means so that you are clear, that you understand how that then is related back to overall provision and the monitoring of whether the right things are in place to support all children with SEND need. So this is largely under the auspices of the SENCO, the person who is leading operationally in school. And this individual must be a qualified teacher. And in a school, in a regular maintained school, this individual, depending on the size of the school, will be designated as the SEND coordinator. And they may be somebody who has agreed to take on that role, has got a special interest in that, and has demonstrated they've got some skills related to that. But once identified as that individual, then they need to, or they must, achieve the SEND coordinator award within 3 years if they are new to that role. And certainly in the school that I'm in, we've got somebody who is doing that role, and they are on that pathway. So they're new to role, but they are now just over a year into working towards that qualification. I think it's important to say here that if you are in a MAT, multi-academy trust, there may be a different way of working with this. So for example, you may have a qualified teacher who holds that designated SEND role for the MAT and then works with a group of school-based individuals that may have a slightly different designation but are responsible at school level for then ensuring that these other 3 bullet point belows are in place, and they work as a team across that trust. So if you are a governor at local level, school level in a multi-academy trust, you may well need to ask some questions to understand how that has that sort of finds its way into your school and how that looks and how they work together. So the SENCO helps to determine the strategic development of the policy and the provision within and across the school. And they provide that professional guidance and advice to other colleagues, particularly if you're thinking about an individual school. They will be providing that professional guidance using their skills to help other teachers in order to put in place strategies within their own classrooms. And a SENCO should have sufficient time, resources and support to carry out this role efficiently across your school. That's quite a big ask in many ways, but this is about making sure that they have that coordination, they feed into that strategic development, and they are able to have that oversight of the resources and the support that is then delivered to classrooms and individual pupils. So let's think a little bit about what this actually means in terms of how do we know as governors. We are not subject knowledge experts. We are not classroom teachers. We are not looking at individual pupils. But in order to make sure that we carry out this function of oversight, we need to be aware of the context of our school. So the numbers of children and the types of need within our school or setting. And these will be unique to your own context. They may look similar to other schools, but they will be unique to your school. So it's important that you don't make assumptions, that you make sure that you understand what it is that we're talking about in our school and how many, in terms of the how many children with SEND we have as a proportion overall of our school and the various different types of needs. In most settings, what we will receive as governor is a head teacher's report and some data that will show us those numbers across the different year groups, anonymised. We should never know about individual pupils, and we're looking at numbers of pupils across those year groups with different types of needs and where they are in terms of the provision that is being provided. So from a EHCP to a child who has been at the very beginning of that journey identified as maybe needing some additional support. So there are 4 main areas of need, and we're taking this from the Code of Practice in its interpretation, and there are 4 broad areas. So the first one is around children who have got difficulty with their speech and language and their coordination, and this may be because they have difficulty saying what they want to or understanding what is being said to them, and the profile for each child will be very different, and none of these main areas of need are necessarily in isolation. So a child may have a variety of different needs, which could include any or all of these or a variety of those. We're thinking possibly here children who have ASD and Asperger's syndrome, and these various different types of needs around speech and language, including children who for some reason aren't able to talk or choose not to talk. When we're looking at cognition and learning, this may be the one that we sort of jump to in our minds when we first think about SEND. This is around children who learn at a slower pace than their peers. They could cover a wide range of needs from moderate to severe, and they're likely to need support in their learning or structured learning so that they can understand concepts and start to form a base of learning in a way that is suitable to their own particular need. And this often will also will also go alongside physical difficulties as well. If we think about the social, emotional, mental health difficulties, this is probably an area that has seen the greatest amount of discussion in more recent times, but this is very much around children who may be withdrawn or isolated, right the way through to displaying challenging or disruptive behaviour. And this may have a root in a wide variety of different things. They may be anxious, there may be a wide range of displays of these kind of physical displays of these kind of emotional traumas, such as particularly in secondary school, some more disturbing issues such as self-harm and substance misuse, eating disorders. But This also includes the group of children that have more difficulty with regulating their own behaviour, and this is an area where most schools are working in terms of self-regulation programs, helping children to understand themselves and put in place actions that will help them maintain and manage their own behaviour. And these are useful across a whole range of different areas of need here, not just the most commonly one that we hear about, which is ADHD. And then we've got that the final group here that is identified is the sensory or physical needs. So some children need that extra support because they've got a disability, which makes it difficult to use those facilities. Because they may have a physical disability, they may have a difficulty with a sensory issue. I've got a child who's doesn't hear very well, totally deaf on one side. So there were areas where things needed to be put in place to meet that those needs. So visual impairment, hearing impairment, physical difficulty, and there's a whole range of different things here that will fall under this category. And there you can understand here that it's all about making sure that all children with any of these areas of needs will have some additional support so that they can have access to all of the same opportunities that other children in the school would make use of. So to summarise this sort of section, if you like, of our responsibilities, the expectations on us as governors, we need to think about what that big picture in our school looks like. So this would be the first place at which you would start now within this context. The total number of children with SEND, knowing the spectrum of need, the context in your school, the number of staff that have specific role around supporting these children and how they are deployed to meet those extra needs, because it may not be even, it's not about one in each class, it's probably very different from that. How the curriculum reflects that inclusive provision. Are we aware of the adaptations that are made to ensure that children with these needs do get equal opportunities to attend extracurricular activities and trips out away from school? And then do we importantly receive data that shows us how pupils are doing as a discrete group so that we can make those comparisons? And are we sufficiently focused on SEND progress that we can have and engage in meaningful discussion at our governing body meetings about SEND? And it helps to frame those. Steve and I are quite big fans of the three. If we've got a wide range of information being presented to us by the school, do we understand the three main areas where we do really well with this particular item, SEND? We're good at these things. We can see where that is demonstrated and evidence. But what are the three most challenging or difficult areas? And what is the school's strategy for supporting those? And what is the impact of those strategies? Because we are, as governors, are all about strategic oversight. So where there is a problem, where there is a difficulty, where there is a challenge, what are our school strategies, and how are those things being put into place throughout the year, and are they having the impact that we have anticipated they will have? And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and we're going to look in a little bit more detail now about monitoring and our activities as a governor on a month-by-month, year-by-year basis.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Linda. Just before we move on for it, so a couple of questions on the panel with regards to some very specific aspects of SEND in terms of funding, etc. we can't really get into that this morning, else we don't. There's an elements that we don't know about, but that's something that may be picked up at a future date. The other thing I just wanted to say was, again, a couple of comments about schools talking about behaviour difficulties for children with SEND. I think it's really important for us as governors to actually understand that inclusion, which in essence is what today's session is all about, means that we are including all children and all young people wherever we can in our schools. And sometimes the manifestation of their needs is what we might refer to as behavioural challenges. Hopefully, we don't any longer use bad behaviour, naughty children, that kind of thing. And I think it's important just to stamp on that as governors, say no, what you might perceive as unacceptable behaviour in a school sometimes is an expression of need, and our expectation of governors should be that the school is working to try and provide, as Linda said, additional support, additional intervention to actually help that child or young person cope with that. So, as Linda said, let's move on and sorry, my slides jammed for a moment there. And just come back to what this looks like in reality. Just wanted to come back to the code of conduct first of all, because the code of conduct, code of practice, sorry, I should say, does say, and this is all in italics on this slide because it's lifted directly from the code of practice. All children and young people are entitled to an appropriate education, one that is appropriate to their needs, promotes high standards and the fulfillment of potential. And I think that tallies totally with what Linda said right at the top of the session. We should be having the same high expectations, having the same level of ambition for children with special educational needs as we do for all others. Their start points might be different, but actually we should still be wanting them to realise their potential. Then goes on to say, of course, this should enable them to firstly achieve their best. That's linked to potential, of course. Become confident individuals living fulfilling lives. So this is actually about that journey, which is why the code of practice itself actually goes to age 25, and very significantly make that successful transition into adulthood. Whether and again, this is the same for all schools, whether they're mainstream or special schools, whether that's a route directly into employment or into further or higher education, or perhaps training, apprenticeship, etc. So this is about ambition, and what we're going to do on the next few slides is look at, well, how as governors do we actually know about this? How do we seek assurance from our schools, from our senior leaders, our SENCOs, etc., that this is actually happening in our settings? Well, one of the ways we do that, of course, is to actually look at, well, are our pupils with special educational needs achieving their best? And of course, there is data out there. Appreciate that if you're in a special school, it's not as easy to actually draw comparison. I would say that that probably goes across all settings. Comparing like with like is never a perfect science, and it certainly isn't when we're talking about performance data for children with special educational needs and disabilities. However, I just wanted to share this with you this morning, which is this is taken from the very latest end of Key Stage 2. I plumped for Key Stage 2 because Key Stage 4 data isn't actually available until probably middle of next month. But this data was published early December. Some of you may have seen this in your schools already, but you may not have actually realised, or you may not have looked at, you may not have been shown that there is a breakdown of the national data looking at attainment, in other words, how youngsters actually performed in those SATs tests at the end of year 6, specifically pulled out in the data that you can get within the performance tables. And what this graph is showing, and I'm not going to spend ages talking to it, but just wanted to say that you've got that key at the bottom, which I've left in because, of course, the years are not in the sequence you might expect them to be. That is, of course, because of COVID. So we've got the 2019 results for the academic year 2018-19, and then it jumps to 21-22 and so on and so forth. The it's not turquoise, is it? But sort of the bluey green color on the right of each of those three bands of bars in that bar chart represents last year, last academic year. And of course, what this is actually showing us, again, there's a comparison over the years. That's not what I want to draw your attention to here. But what I would say is you've got this data here that says nationally, and apologies to those colleagues, and I know we've got several of you joining us from Wales, you have your own data, which I'm assuming is presented in a similar format. This is England only, because of course Wales, like Scotland and Northern Ireland, has its own education system. And for England only, this is actually giving us the percentage of pupils at the end of Key Stage 2, whereas the end of Year 6, who met the expected standard in reading, writing and maths, so all three of those combined. And first group of coloured blocks on the left-hand side of that bar chart at the near the bottom or second bottom half of the screen shows you performance of all children at the end of that Key Stage 2 that had SEND, how they performed in those SATs tests, and you can see it's just on over. It's probably about 22% in total. Block in the middle represents those youngsters of that total population of pupils with SEN who actually have an EHCP, an education healthcare plan, and then those on the right-hand block is those with SEN support. The reason it's important as governors we know this data's there is it doesn't actually give us any answers, but it does, and it should fuel our questions. Don't ever describe data as interesting, is what Linda and I always say. Say it's useful. And the use of this data is that, well, actually, if all schools nationally, this is the average, how did we compare in our school for our pupils with special educational needs and disabilities in comparison? Let's look at those with the HCPs. Let's look at those who are just getting support under SDN. We're not comparing like with like, but again, it's a very helpful springboard for us actually getting that data. And of course, we should, as governors, be having internal data shared with us on an ongoing basis. Looking at, sorry, Linda.
Sorry, Steve. Jamie's asked a question about data for Key Stage 5.
Yeah, data for Key Stage 5 will be coming out the same as data for Key Stage 4. Again, it will depend. Key Stage 5, those of you who are perhaps not familiar, is post 16. So if you've got a sixth form in your school, then you will have Key Stage 5 data. Although I said the government data hasn't been published, many secondary schools do use things like ALPS data, and that will already have provided schools with an analysis. So it is possible to break down all of that data because it's there. And if you're not seeing it routinely as a governor, I would suggest you ask the question, can it be shared with us? But as I say, internal data is available in all of our schools. Whether it's shared with governors or not is a matter to be discussed. If it's not shared, our view is, sorry, excuse me, our view is it should be. So in terms of that overview of outcomes, our monitoring as governors and trustees in our schools and trusts should include all of these things on this, all four of these bullet points on this slide in front of you now. I say head teacher reports. It may not be a head teacher, depending on the size of the school. It may well be that you have an assessment lead, but whoever, somebody should be reporting to us as governors on a pretty regular basis on any changes that there are to that context that Linda talked about. Many of our schools have in-year admissions, but actually at the very least, once a year, we should be talking about what are the characteristics of the year that's actually just come into the school, whether that's a year 3 in a Key Stage 2 school, a year R in a through primary, or a year 7 in the secondary. We should be talking about, because what we don't want as governors is a big surprise when we get to year 11, for example, in the secondary school, and GCSE results are a little bit disappointing, and then somebody turns around from the school and says, well, yes, but of course we knew when they came in the year 7 that our prior attainment was actually quite low. That's the sort of information that should be shared with us as governors. Similarly, we should be looking at, is this a year group, a cohort of children where there's a high incidence of special educational needs? And again, within that, what are the types of needs represented? Does that have an impact on the way in which we should, as governors, be expecting support to be provided for those youngsters? What are we doing to make sure that they do achieve their full potential, that they do perform in their SATs tests, their GCSEs, etc., the way that we would want them to? So looking at that data on a regular basis for those groups of pupils, and I say that data, that internal data, so teacher assessments, tests, formative and summative forms of assessment, are we looking at those by significant pupil groups? Many of our schools have done that to probably quite a great extent for disadvantaged pupils, those funded by pupil premium. Do we take the same level of interest in pupils with SEND? Because we should. So again, when we're looking at that end of key stage data, we should be specifically in every single school, because every single school will have pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, we should be highlighting and focusing on the attainment and progress of pupils with SEND. Did they perform as well as we wanted to? Have we learned any lessons from the way in which we've made provision for these pupils that perhaps we could change the way we do things going forward? All of these are the kind of really good quality questions that as governors we should be asking of our senior leadership teams. It's a very strong demonstration of accountability. And of course, it doesn't stop just with academic performance and data that actually bears that out. We should be seeking other data on our SEND pupils. We talked earlier about destinations at the end of school. So are they going into further or higher education? Are they actually gaining apprenticeships, or are they going into employment? What's happening? That's one set of data. But where we've got pupils with a very high level of need, sometimes with profound levels of need, do we actually get information that talks about the progress that they're making? Linda talked about ARP's additional resource provision in school, or sometimes called units or special needs centres in mainstream schools. I happen to be a governor of a school that has an ARP. One of the things that we always talk about, and again, we don't name individual children, we don't know individual children, but we have had in the last 3-4 years or so, several non-verbal children actually join the school in Year R, and we have had little mini case studies, vignettes, talk about the level of need these children came in with, and actually the progress that they've made, not just academically, that's relevant as well, of course, but actually now they are able to socialise more. They are picking up some vocabulary. They are beginning to actually develop social skills, self-confidence, self-esteem, etc. All of that's important. It speaks to the ethos of our school, and of course, it's a very real demonstration of inclusion as well. So if we're thinking about specifically monitoring pupil progress, which of course, we can't lose sight of the fact that every pupil comes to school to learn and to make progress in their learning, so that should be our prime focus as governors. So our responsibility is to ensure that those pupils in our schools that do have special educational needs and disabilities, their progress, but also their attainment is reported discreetly, and when I say discreetly, I mean separately, of course, to governor meetings. Doesn't have to be to the full board, although I would suggest it's an important aspect of the whole school, so I would argue it should be. But if you have a designated committee that perhaps looks at standards and performance, it's perfectly okay to actually have it detailed there. And when we think about assessment data, what we should be expecting as governors, I don't want to use the word demanding, that sounds a little bit too pejorative, but what we should expect as governors is data that shows us prior attainment. So in other words, where were these children judged to be? If we're through primary school, what did their early years foundation stage profile say to us? If we're a secondary school and we've got youngsters coming out of primary, what were their end of key stage SATs? That's a bit of a challenge in this current year that we're in, of course, because again, that was the COVID years, so there isn't anything formal as such. But of course, most secondary schools will do their own assessment on entry anyway, so there will be, or there should be, something there. And then, of course, once we know that start point, we look at attainment, and we should look at that, if it's appropriate in our schools, by level of need. Although we've got that national data that groups all pupils with special educational needs and disabilities together, as we said, it's not a homogenous group. It really isn't. There will be lots of different needs. You might have some children with physical disabilities who have no cognitive needs at all. They just need help getting around the school, accessing their own learning equipment, etc. Um, you might have some children who are on the autism spectrum who have a variety of different needs. Some of them are what's deemed to be high performing and can absolutely function at a level where they're achieving as well as their peers, but there may be support that they need, and that's what I'm talking about understanding as governors. And of course, once we know their attainment and we know the start point, we then can talk about the progress they've made. Progress, of course, is always relevant to the start point. Something that I don't think enough boards do, in my experience, is think about actually having those discussions that look at, well, this is what our results look like this year. How does that compare with the targets or the predictions or projected outcomes that we set in place perhaps at the start of the year, or certainly the secondary school where I'm chair, we actually on a termly basis look at what our projected outcomes are for the summer examinations. And we always, in the autumn term, do a little bit of not it's not a star chamber or an inquest, but we do a little bit of reflecting on, well, yeah, if the outcomes, the reality of the outcomes was different from our projections, what are the reasons that actually underpin that, and are there lessons to be learned there? And something that's come up, I know, with quite a few questions on the panel, talking about other groups of pupils within the school. Somebody asked the question, which I responded to on the panel earlier, about English additional language, EAL as it's put there. Simply because English is not your first language does not of itself mean that you have a special educational need. However, there will, of course, be pupils within that group, as well as those attracting pupil premium, and lots of other groups who do have special needs. So if you remember back to, I'm so old, I did O-levels at school, but if you remember back to your GCSEs, or if you did do O-levels, you probably learned about Venn diagrams. This will actually make some very interesting Venn diagrams in our school, because there will be pupils with special educational needs who also are pupil premium. They might also be English additional language, and of course, if we think of the gender split between boys and girls, that's something to think about there. So we should actually have an overall understanding. Again, not about individuals. This is actually about understanding that context. And just a reminder at the bottom there that non-academic progress is equally as important. I wanted to say something before we finish the session just about provision mapping, because provision mapping is another tool that's available to schools, and an overview of it absolutely can be shared with governors. Lots of you have asked questions about funding. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know where funding is going forward. Hopefully, some of the issues that we have nationally will be addressed, but we don't know that for sure, so we can't speculate. But what we can do is say that the funding we have at the moment for special needs, if we are using in our schools the provision mapping tools, that allows us to, if you will, cost out all of those elements of provision that are put in place for individual children. And then, of course, we can aggregate that to say, well, this is a provision map for what we do in our schools. Many of you in your schools will have on your school's website, you should have details of your provision there, but you'll have on your school's website a summary of the provision map. Very often it talks about wave 1, wave 2, wave 3. All that is saying that for a specific level of need, these are some of the options on, if you like, our menu or our shopping list that we have available within our school that we can put in place to support pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. It is used primarily for schools to enable them to monitor, but also to plan development of provision, of course, for those pupils with special educational needs. But I've said in those, as I've said in those bottom 5 mini bullet points there, you can also use it for other groups. So, I've listed more able, vulnerable, etc. there. It can be used for any and all of those groups, but it should be used for SEND pupils. one very good reason why is, of course, as governors, as Linda said right at the very beginning, we are responsible, statutorily responsible, for ensuring that pupils do receive the support that they need. And of course, the support that they need is actually funded if they've got an EHCP. It's funded through your delegated pupil funding for everybody else, and that's what we use that money on classroom assistants usually. But whatever that support is, it's important as governors that we receive that assurance that we are spending the funding that we get for special educational needs and disabilities on those pupils that do have it, SEND. And there are individual provision maps. Now, as I say, it is not appropriate for us to actually see these with names on. Sometimes it might be possible, providing it doesn't actually give anybody the opportunity to identify who it relates to look at anonymised versions. Linda mentioned the designated SEND governor. If you're the SEND governor, it might be helpful perhaps sometimes just to deepen your level of understanding, to talk to the SENCO and say, well, what does a provision map look like? Could I see an anonymised one? And again, if you don't think the SENCO is actually going to worry too much about our ability to be able to identify individual pupils or families, make that point to them as well. It's good to know that, sorry, it's good to show, I should say, that you're aware as a governor. So what these individual provision maps, or IPMs, as they're very often abbreviated to, what they show for each child, first and foremost, is what are the needs they've got? What did this child present with when they first started at the school? If they are a child or young person with an education and healthcare plan, Section F specifically details the provision that's actually put in place for them. But that can actually be detailed on the provision map anyway, whether or not they've got an EHCP. It's also a requirement of the provision map, and it's personally, I think it's really helpful because it says, well, okay, if you're doing this provision, what difference do you think it's going to make? In other words, what impact is this having? We're making a spending decision, and as governors, we should hopefully seek assurance that every single spending decision is made with the knowledge of the impact that it is anticipated to going to bring. There should also be information there about the progress of individual learners. That might be academic, it might be personal development wise, but nonetheless, there should be something about progress in there. And it is a document that is intended to be a dynamic one. It should be reviewed on a regular basis. The guidance on the provision mapping tool says that it should be used for termly reviews with class teachers, and that might be with head teachers, pupil progress reviews, that kind of thing, but also shared with parents so that parents are actually seeing there in black and white. And this isn't about saying, as a parent, you have the right to know how much money is spent on your child and you want to demand what's not being spent, etc. This is about saying, this is about progress. This is about measuring pupil progress and looking at what we're doing. It doesn't necessarily have a price list on it. It can do, and schools have to make decisions about whether that's shared with parents or not. Just before we finished, I wanted to just share with you what I believe is actually a very helpful resource. Again, notice I'm using the word helpful, not interesting here. It is interesting, of course it is, but we should be thinking about, well, how can this actually be used? Many of you will be familiar with the Education Endowment Foundation. They produce a whole raft of different guidance documents and resources for schools to use. There is a specific resource here called Special Educational Needs in Mainstream Schools. So in other words, this isn't looking at special schools, so apologies to governors from special schools for a moment. But if you're a governor in a mainstream school, be it in primary or secondary, this is actually quite helpful. Particularly want to draw your attention just to the orange column, number 3 in the middle there. And again, this comes back to the comment Linda made right at the very start of the session, ensuring all pupils have access to high quality teaching. High quality teaching makes a difference to every single pupil. And very often, I think, and again, I'm not suggesting this is wrong, but I am suggesting it's something that governors should question. Very often, there will be a learning support assistant or a special needs teaching assistant or whatever their title is, as Linda said earlier, who is there working with pupils with special educational needs in a classroom. they might be sitting on a table with them, etc. But actually, do those children benefit from time to time from having the class teacher working with them? Because actually there is lots of evidence, and the Education Endowment Foundation, its foundations are about evidence-based research and how that's actually interpreted and actually used in the classroom. There's lots and lots of evidence that says they will make much more progress if they were. Now, that would work for everybody, but actually, historically, most schools have not done that. And it's just something, again, have a look at the report, have a look at this particular document, and maybe use it to fuel a question or two that would be helpful for you. And in summary, I think that what we're trying to do here is just pull the threads together. Linda and I both fervently believe that context is everything for virtually all aspects of provision of school, but particularly when we're talking about pupils with SEND, we have to know as governors and trustees what our context is, how it changes over time, what that means in terms of the provision that we put in place for those pupils with SEND. School budgets do include funds specifically for SEND. Now, they'll be topped up for pupils with the HCPs, of course, but every single school, based on its census, will get some money in its budget which is intended to meet the ongoing support that pupils with SEND actually require. As governors, do we know where our spending is prioritised, and do we know how that is actually spent? Crossover here with pupil premium, for many, many years, since it first came out in 2011, schools have spent their pupil premium on exactly the same thing, very often teaching assistants, classroom assistants. Does that make a difference? Is it actually improving outcomes? Have outcomes improved in the last 13, 14 years? Because if they haven't, as governors, we should actually be calling into question some of the decisions that are being made about how that money is being spent, and exactly the same is true for SEND. It's all about value for money, of course, but value for money in itself is all about outcomes. If as governors, if as trustees, we are making decisions about how spending priorities are set, which are not improving outcomes, please forgive me if I'm being rude to this, but I think we're making the wrong decisions. I think we have to reflect on the decisions that we make as governors and know that they are actually having a positive impact on our children and young people. And last but by no means least, outcomes and provision mapping should be there as a source of evidence for us, a source of evidence, which is what today's webinar has been all about, that we know with confidence that the needs of our pupils with special educational needs are actually being met. Okay, well, that's all that Linda and I wanted to say, folks, unless there are any other questions. I don't know whether there are any on the panel that we want to address just before we've got about 2 minutes, I think, Linda.
I think that there's sort of more general questions. Funding we've covered already. Paul's made a comment about that. Sue is asking about data comparisons across the country, a sort of league table. But I think that's very difficult, isn't it? Because the context of need is going to be so very different. To make comparisons from one group to another is very difficult.
No, absolutely. And as we said, or I'm sorry, as I said, when we looked at the performance tables for Key Stage 2, that is if you like, that is a snapshot picture for the whole country. We can do comparisons ourselves against that. There is a website called Compare School and College Performance that is in the public domain. Anybody can access that website, and you can. So, for example, if you want to look at the performance of pupils with special educational needs in your school compared to another school 2 miles away, which has a very similar profile to you, or you believe it does, you can do that. But again, it doesn't provide answers. It's actually all about fueling questions. So the sort of questions we should then be taking back and asking in governor meetings, I would suggest.
And I think one final one from Jamie, who is asking about, on a practical level, a template for meeting agendas for SEND governors. Is there one available? I think this is something that you really have to design with the context of your school in mind, and
Absolutely.
based on the things that you've already said throughout the session around data and what that actually means for you, and forming those questions based on that. So it would not be practical for a context-related set of templates for your school to necessarily work somewhere else.
Indeed. Okay, well, at that stage, folks, as I say, if there are any questions, we will review the question panel afterwards. If there are any that we haven't answered, we'll get back to you individually. But just to say thank you very much for joining us. There is a slide here, then, as if a slide pack is actually going to be sent out, giving you the URLs or the links for those key documents that we've actually talked about this morning, including the Education Endowment Foundation one at the bottom there. And as I say, it just remains for Linda and I to say thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. We do hope to you'll come back for the next session we do, which is in a month or so's time. Thank you for getting up early if you did get early, or thank you for sacrificing your morning. Enjoy what's left of the rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.